When Donald Trump announced a 50-day ultimatum for Russia to finally end its war in Ukraine this week, it got me thinking. Not about whether or not the conflict would be over in a couple of months' time. I doubt there's many serious observers of Russia or Ukraine or even the United States who expect that that will happen. But more about how the war has become a part of daily life. It's become part of daily life, most of all for Ukrainians, who are having to live with the daily reality of drone and missile strikes, of thousands of soldiers killed and wounded every month, while millions more are internally displaced or have fled abroad. And all are having to come to terms with the reality that they simply cannot make plans for seeing their homes in the foreseeable future. In a lesser but still significant way, the conflict has also become part of our lives too. For those in the United States or in Europe for whom the war is described as something almost as existential as it is for Ukrainians. The constant back and forth over how much weaponry should be provided to Ukraine and who should pay for it is framed as a core part of this conversation around the entire makeup of the liberal Western order. I wanted to explore that idea of the war becoming an ever-present fixture of life today, so I asked Christopher Miller to join us on the podcast. Christopher is the Financial Times' chief Ukraine correspondent, and he wrote a well-reviewed book, The War Came to Us, all about the conflict and the way it imposed itself on people's lives. That became all too apparent during our conversation, as Chris himself sat through an air raid warning in Kiev that went off just as we were speaking, as you'll hear. I also asked my colleague Amie Ferris-Rotman, New Lines' global news editor, to join us, given her many years of experience reporting on Russia. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here is this week's episode of The Lead. Christopher Miller, Amie Ferris-Rotman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you guys.
Thanks.
Chris, I wanted to start with a bigger question, really, from your book. Your book is a great read. I mean, a sad read, obviously, about the war in Ukraine. The war came to us. But in that book, you speak to a huge variety of characters around Ukraine. And there's one character from Mariupol who describes how she fled with nothing at the start of the invasion because she didn't think she'd be away for very long. And I wonder how, 3 years on, have you, and with no end in sight, have you spoken to any of those characters recently? How do they feel about where the war is going and the progress?
I keep in touch with a lot of the characters from the book. You know, many of them aren't strangers to me or people I ran into just one or two times. A lot of them are close friends of mine, people who I got to know when I lived out in eastern Ukraine all the way back in between 2010 and 2012. And so, you know, there are characters in the book, but they're people I know well and I've kept in touch with. I would say right now they're still all kind of spread around the country or even outside of the country. For example, two of my best friends in the book, Ira and Igor, who were from Bakhmut, they now live here in Kiev with their two children. They work for international humanitarian organizations. A couple of others, including, I think the woman from Mariupol, they live elsewhere in Ukraine. And some other friends live as far away as Germany. I have a couple of friends from Bakhmut, as well as the city adjacent to it in Konstantinovka that's now being hit really hard and being threatened with encirclement by Russian forces, who now live in Tennessee. So all of my friends are really spread around. And I would say that's really typical of what has happened in the sort of disbursement of millions of Ukrainians since the beginning of this war. You know, I forget the exact figures, but I know it's upwards of 6 or 7 million Ukrainians that have fled their homes, gone abroad. A vast majority of them have remained abroad. And then that doesn't even count the millions of Ukrainians who've been internally displaced. Right?
Which is much bigger.
It's much bigger, and it an interesting element is the demographic shifts of places outside of the regions where the ground war is being waged, right? So you've got people whose political ideologies are somewhat or have been traditionally different than those of people in other parts of the country, now coalescing in far corners of Western Ukraine that are considered to be some of the safer places, right?
Yeah.
So things have really, really changed quite a lot in terms of where people have gone and just how many of them have, I guess, to get back to your point, stayed where they landed after the original invasion 3.5 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, this is the part that I was really interested in. I think this is why we wanted to have this conversation, because it does feel as if there is this permanent war in Ukraine now, which is endless war. And regardless of, we'll get to the 50-day deadline that Trump has offered, but regardless of that, it doesn't feel as if there is likely to be a coherent peace anytime soon. And so I'm quite interested in how Ukraine is adjusting to this new reality. And as you say, like the communities, because when people move, even if they move internally, they move to Kiev or they move abroad, they start to put down roots, they send their kids to school, they get jobs, they start to live their lives. And 3 years on, a lot of Ukraine, yes, some of them are in limbo, but a lot of Ukraine must be just planning for the long haul.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who have accepted what is the new reality of a relentless, endless war against Russia. I'll give you a story of a guy who I met at a border crossing a little over a year ago now. He had lived in southern Ukraine in, I believe it was in Kherson region, on the side that's occupied by Russian forces. And he had lived under Russian occupation for the first year and a half, and his wife and daughter had to leave and come to government-controlled parts of Ukraine for health reasons. I think his daughter was suffering from cancer, and so he was living alone in occupied Russian territory. And the pressure had just mounted, pressure that is by the Russian occupation authorities and soldiers there. And a lot of his neighbors had been frog marched away into basements, or according to him, some of them shot on the spot after being accused of spying for the Ukrainian secret services. And he was under threat of having his home taken away and possibly being arrested unless he took Russian citizenship. So he finally decided it was time to leave. He made his way through occupied territories into Russia, up around to a border crossing where Russian guards let him walk several kilometers through and then eventually across the Ukrainian border. And he told me when he got to the other side that he had accepted the fact that he would very likely never be able to return. He had to leave most of his possessions and things behind. And he told me, I just left the front door unlocked because I knew the soldiers would come in there sooner or later and help themselves no matter what. And I figured it'd be better if they didn't have to break down the door, And so, it's that sort of resignation that I think is really gut-wrenching, but is really taking hold here. I mentioned my friends from Bakhmut, and of course, many of them would, of course, love to return to their homes, but they don't even have homes to return to because the city has been completely razed to the ground. Here in Kiev, I would say it's a little bit different for people who aren't from those areas where Russian forces have either occupied towns or destroyed them, but it's still hell living under, these bombardments of missiles and drones that are only escalating and only getting larger by the week. And a lot of them are now deciding whether or not it's worth staying even in the capital. A lot of them are banking on the United States in particular, but the European Union and NATO countries, people it considers its allies, to help it with air defense systems. Otherwise, a lot of them, I know personally, are considering moving further west or even out of the country. Right, so people are planning for things to get worse, not to get better in the near and even long term.
Amie, let me bring you in on this, because I think that's one of the parts that I think is so interesting, that this endless war now, as Chris says, is people are starting to prepare for a life beyond it. I mean, of course, there is this incredible unity in Ukraine where they're very desirous of fighting the occupation of the Russians. And yet at the same time, people have to live their lives. And with so many Ukrainians abroad, so many women and children have gone abroad, there's a tendency to think, okay, well, we have to start looking to the next 3 years. We can't just think about the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we've seen with other conflicts around the world, that's what happens. People you get used to the new normal. There's certainly a feeling across Europe as well. It depends on which country you're talking about. But the outpouring of empathy we saw at the start of the war by Europeans and the welcoming of those fleeing has largely dissipated, and the landscape here is changing dramatically, I'd say, as other conflicts take hold and people are met with conflict fatigue. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
was thinking about this actually. I think you and I were talking about this, but I was thinking that you remember at the beginning of the war in the UK, there were a few MPs, members of Parliament, who said, "Oh, I'm going to take in a Ukrainian refugee like that," and I thought you can't really imagine that today.
no,
It would be a big
absolutely.
story if someone, there would be all sorts of questions around it, like, why are you doing that? Isn't it time the war ended? You know, these sorts of questions which weren't there 3 years ago.
They were not there indeed. In fact, I mean, the family, is it the family resettlement scheme or one of the British government schemes hosting Ukrainian refugees or families has stopped. So you can't even apply for that if you wanted to. I do think Gaza, well, first of all, there is conflict fatigue, Ukraine fatigue. I'm not saying that's right, but that is what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reality, right? After 3 years of conflict.
I would say so. And also Gaza. I mean, the horrors that are unfolding in Gaza has taken over a lot of people's minds and hearts. And I'm here in London. There's protests every Saturday in the centre of London for the people of Gaza, for Palestinians. You don't see that sort of support or interest in Ukraine anymore.
What impact, Amie, about this? What impact do you think that fatigue is having in Western capitals? Because you've seen some support dropping away from European countries. Of course, now we have a new president in Trump who doesn't seem all that interested in the war going in Ukraine's favor. You start to worry that it's not just the people, it's also the governments that have just had enough and want to find a way out of this.
I definitely think the governments have had enough. But of course, Europe's not a monolith, and some countries have more at stake than others. The Baltics, for example, those countries, former Soviet countries that border Russia, obviously, they're extremely keen to see this war end, to not have a victorious Russia. Their own security is at stake. Then we have other countries like Poland, which was a huge supporter of Ukraine.
Yeah, right next door.
Right next door, took in the lion's share of refugees. That support has dropped. And I mean, that's for various reasons, but including domestic reasons as well. And I think, it's slipping out of people's consciousness. And then watching the head of NATO, the new head of NATO, Mark Rutte, fawn over President Trump and call him daddy, which we all saw. I mean, whatever we think about that, that sends a signal that is how that's how the NATO Secretary General is feeling. And I'm sure some people would agree with him.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, this might be a moment to bring you in, because there was a maxim in Ukraine that you mentioned in your book, which was that if Russia stops fighting, there'll be no more war. But if Ukraine stops fighting, there'll be no more Ukraine. I wonder if you think that, talking about the politics of it, I wonder if you think that Zelensky has managed to convey that message to Trump in any way? Or do you think now, I don't want to diminish the Ukrainians, but do you think that there's a kind of feeling that, like with Mark Rutte, with Trump, that we have other big politics to worry about, and this small issue just needs to go away?
Well, I'm certain that Zelensky has tried to get that message across to Donald Trump. We've seen him, for example, at the Oval Office, which I think a lot of people have said was a mistake, not only to go there, but also to present to him these images of tortured Ukrainian soldiers, right, who had been in Russian captivity, thinking that might, sort of tug on his heartstrings. But those are the types of things that he doesn't really react to, right? I'm not sure showing him these gruesome images was a way of really attracting greater support from Trump. And certainly in the aftermath of that disastrous meeting, people thought it was not a great idea. I think what the Ukrainians and Zelensky have tacked to now is dealing with Trump in a very transactional manner, which is what Trump likes to do and how he views the world, right, as business dealings. And in my conversations with the Zelensky administration, they say they go into these with, a much more pragmatic head. They don't try to appeal emotionally to him. I think they still do appeal to the world in an emotional way, certainly when there's a massive Russian aerial assault and we see dozens of people killed and injured, right? And actually, just as I speak right now, I don't know if you can hear, we've got an air raid alert and sirens right now. But as when these air attacks happen, certainly they're they point out those things, but they deal with Trump in a more pragmatic manner now, and that's how they're approaching it.
Well, just on that, because I
Mhm.
think the audience will find it interesting. I mean, obviously you understand it's a lived reality for you, but what happens when you're in Kiev, as you are, and these air raid sirens go off? I mean, you have things to do. You have your daily life, right? Do you need to immediately go into the shelters?
No, my routine is I don't immediately go to the shelter. So I'm sitting here talking to you now. I'm chatting with you. I'm looking at my phone, and I got a text alert before the sirens started blaring, and it says there's an air raid alert. Proceed to a shelter.
Hmm.
And I look at that, and then I go to another app where the whatever is incoming toward us, typically drones and missiles, we can see on this map the sort of direction from which they were launched and where they're headed. The Ukrainian Air Force makes or posts updates on its Telegram channels in real time about the trajectory of these weapons, and
Hmm.
so it gives us a sense, for example, if they're drones, that we have, a longer period of time to react and to go to shelter. It might be dozens of minutes or a couple of hours, because they fly much slower than, say, a cruise missile or especially a ballistic missile. Now, if we get an alert and it says there are ballistic missiles in the air, you'll see people run to the shelters, like actually run, not walk to the shelters, because with those you have just a couple of minutes, if even less, if they're fired from just on the northern border, to get to a place of safety. Once I saw this alert that I just mentioned, I looked out my window and I saw several of my neighbors across the street close their windows and blinds. So what we're told to do is, if we don't want to go to a shelter or can't get to one, people are encouraged to close their windows, close their curtains over them, to try to keep any glass that might be shattered from an explosion from spraying inward, and then get into a bathtub or a bathroom or into a room that's as far away from the windows as possible, because we have this rule of two walls, which is you should try to be behind as many walls as possible, at the very least two. One to take the initial impact, and the second to absorb as much of the shrapnel and debris as possible. Think that might keep you at least relatively safe and hopefully alive in the event that there's a large explosion outside.
What do you think that does to the mentality of people who are trying to go about their daily lives?
Oh, people are mentally fried. Yeah, they're just exhausted. I mean, this has been 3.5 years of war and an air campaign that's only escalated in the past couple of months. Air raid alerts now, we get them multiple times a day, and Russia does this thing where they'll launch several successive, large-scale, far-reaching missile and drone attacks that will last through the night, ensuring that you don't get any sleep, that you're terrified with your family and neighbors in the dark for hours on end. Some of these will start at 9 or 10 p.m. and go until 5 or 6 a.m., just making it impossible really to sleep. And then the next morning, those people who are able to go to work walk very, very slowly. I say joke here because Ukrainians are just masters at black humor and try not to show that these Russian attacks affect them, but they
Yeah.
jokingly say, we all waddle to work like zombies. But nevertheless, they go. And I would say, that's also something worth noting, because it's this, little act of defiance, right? I have a lot of friends who will, rather than trying to sleep during the day or something and skip work, in their own little personal act of defiance and middle finger to Russia, will go to work and try to go about their lives as if they can't be disturbed by the war.
This is something, Amie, I know you've experienced in other countries, like, for example, Afghanistan, that when the toll of it that it takes on your mental health, and of course, you were there as a journalist, but other people are there just living their lives. Like, they have to go to the accountants the next day, and they have to open up their coffee shop, and people have to just continue living daily life. And when you're under this constant level of mental trauma, it's very, very hard to just keep going.
It is, and Afghanistan is a country that has experienced war for 4 decades continuously, and you see it. Obviously, that it's a very different country from Ukraine because of its history and in terms of its poverty levels and literacy and all of that. But to see a war against a civilian population for that long, there's all sorts of problems which I think people are already beginning to see happen in Ukraine. I mean, domestic violence rates increase, right?
Yeah.
And we're already, I mean, seeing things like that in Ukraine. You get disruptions to education in a severe way. But then, as Chris said, you also have people who see existing as an act of defiance, right? Obviously, we all know that the longer you have a war in your country, the worse it's going to be for the civilian population. And it's awful to see it. I mean, Chris is there in Kyiv, but it's awful that we in the West are watching as this continues to drag on with seemingly no end in sight because of the way Russia acts.
We were talking about the Trump-Zelensky relationship just before. Let's go back to that just a bit. In a way, Amie, it's not just a two-way relationship, the Trump-Zelensky relationship. Really, it's kind of a three-way relationship with Putin as well, because you can't really disentangle these three people from each other.
Sadly, no. No, you can't, because there is one person who has instigated all of this, and that is Vladimir Putin. I think that we can all agree on that here.
Yeah. And one person who could end it, right?
Yep. He's the only person who could end it. And absolutely. And also, I think we can't forget that Trump, I mean, he admires Putin. I think people really need to understand this. And I don't know if people, and by people I mean all the news watchers.
Like the wider, because you talk about this a lot, that you don't feel that, I mean, you've obviously observed Putin for a very long time. You lived in Russia and you know America very well. But you still feel that people don't quite get this odd dynamic that they have.
I really don't think they do. And I just, because I was in Moscow as a reporter during the first Trump administration, and, like all reporters there working for American media, I was told to go find the smoking gun.
The smoking gun for the audience is whether there was any, what they call compromat, which is why people think that Trump is so responsive to Putin's considerations.
Right, this idea that Russia won Trump the election because it has some video footage of something compromising of Trump, or it's got some secret information. I mean, while we were all chasing that story to no avail, and I think a lot of Americans didn't really they liked the idea of having this scapegoat of Russia, whereas not understanding that actually Trump appeals to many of their fellow countrymen and women. And I'm not saying that Russia is completely innocent here or didn't meddle, but it was not the reason that Trump got elected. And I think now we're in Trump 2.0. Everyone, I mean, that whole kind of idea of Russiagate has disappeared. And instead, we are simply witnessing again Trump's, I would say, admiration for Putin. Obviously, he gets frustrated with him regularly, but there's something clearly about being this brash bully who's driven by wealth that appeals to Trump.
I mean, it's so extraordinary because Trump is not a diplomat. He does not speak about Putin the way he speaks about any other world leader. With every other world leader, even if they are people that the government should have a good relationship with, like France, he's very happy to criticize Macron personally, to say he doesn't know anything, or in the past he said things about British prime ministers. But when it comes to, let alone the things that he said, for example, about Ayatollah Khamenei or other people, but when it comes to Putin, for some reason, the language is moderated, and I'm just not sure. Maybe he's playing me. All this this very gentle, uncertain language, tap dancing around the obvious.
Yeah, no, it's a real bromance. I mean, bromance implies it's two-way. I don't think Putin.
I don't think it's the other way.
No, Putin is more strategic than Trump, that's for sure. And Russia has always wanted to have a seat at the big kids' table at the dinner party, and that is America.
He certainly appears to have persuaded Trump that it is only the two of them that can decide this conflict, that these two great powers will sit down and decide what needs to happen with Ukraine, like that.
Exactly. And I think that whole kind of concept of great powers appeals enormously to Trump, because Trump and his whole America's Amazing MAGA thinking. So obviously he's thinking, oh, yes, absolutely. America is the true great power here. And of course, Russia wants to be the great power. Russia has not gotten over the fact that it lost its superiority and domination over a huge amount of the Earth's land when the Soviet Union collapsed.
I mean, there was a period of time, the 50 years of the Cold War, when the entirety of the Western world was focused on what would the Russians do.
Yep.
And that's gone away now.
Yeah, Russia brought the West to its knees in the Cold War in the 1960s. And I'm absolutely sure that Putin would love to see that again. Yeah.
Chris, the criticism that you talked about, that infamous meeting that they had in the Oval Office, he has in the past criticized Zelensky, but do you think that is now reflected in Ukrainian society? I mean, is there some sort of frustration with Zelensky's, I don't want to say Zelensky's lack of progress in the war, but, you know, the general stalemate that seems to be happening, or worse than stalemate, actually?
I think, well, yeah, there is a lot of frustration on the part of Ukrainians right now, aimed at both leaders, at Trump and Zelensky, right? So Ukrainians are, of course, frustrated with Trump that he won't just provide to them what they believe they need to protect their skies, to keep their cities safe, to help their soldiers on the front line, not only slow or stop Russia's advances, but to repel them and push them out of the country, right? They want more from Trump, and that frustrates them to no end. And so does his language, his fawning language or words for Putin. They just don't understand, of course, why he would speak so admiringly of an authoritarian leader who is doing his darndest to completely destroy a people in their country. On Zelensky, Ukrainians are frustrated, of course, because they have some questions that date back even to the very start of the war. Why were they so unprepared? Why did Zelensky dismiss Western intelligence as he did?
Right.
He remains widely popular. He's popular than I think, if not all, certainly most world leaders, according to polls here, right? And I think he even tops many of our polls in the West that ask, people, which global leaders do you trust? And so he remains widely popular, but there is growing frustration right now because of the very thing that we spoke about earlier, which is that this war is dragging on. There's no end in sight. There's no real strategy here about, how to go about achieving a lasting ceasefire at the very least, let alone an end to this, a solution to it, right? And there are things happening in Ukrainian society at the moment that have raised some pretty worrying issues and concerns. There's a real consolidation of power happening as we speak. Just today, on Wednesday, the government has been dismissed. The prime minister has tendered his resignation, and he is now gone. He'll be shuffled over to become the defense minister. And someone who is a very loyal person to Zelensky and his powerful chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, will be made the prime minister tomorrow. And several other positions are not going to be filled by any new faces or independently minded people or any politician from opposition parties, but they'll be shuffled around and filled by people who are already in the government, which continues to shrink and be concentrated more and more in the powers of Zelensky's presidential office. There's also this happening at the same time. There's this crackdown on anti-corruption crusaders and people who have previously worked in government but fallen out of favor with the president. So there's all of this mounting pressure on Ukraine's presidency, its government, its society, and we're at this real difficult moment where a lot of people feel like we're standing, perhaps on the precipice of something really bad that is not just the escalation of Russia's war, but perhaps the fracturing or collapse of this unity that we've seen in Ukraine over the past 3 years that's kept it together and collectively against Russia.
Yeah, actually, this was something I wanted to ask you about. You talk about this in your book. You describe the heady feeling from the Euromaidan protests all the way back in 2013. And you write that at that point, the personal walls, is the quote, that had defined the limits of Ukrainian society would collapse, and you have this diverse mix of people joining together in a single unified mission. The mission at the time was to overthrow the then government of President Yanukovych. I wonder if you feel that that unified mission remains, and if it does, is it really fraying at the edges, as you were talking about, or cracking in the middle, perhaps more accurately?
I think there's still a large and really strong base of Ukrainians who are dedicated to, that European westward mission, being a part of the Western world, becoming a part of the European Union. They very much still hold on to that idea of the Euromaidan, this democratic revolution. But for a lot of people, it wasn't a democratic revolution. It was an uprising against state violence and abuse of power. And there are people here in Ukraine who are fighting alongside those idealists and Euro optimists who aren't thrilled about the concept of joining the European Union. They might be anti-Russian, but they're not necessarily liberal-minded progressives. I think there's something interesting happening in Ukrainian society right now where a lot of people are growing more and more nationalistic, not necessarily like far right or far right in this way that has this sort of negative connotation that might be associated with these smears from the Russian side that Ukraine is full of neo-Nazis, right? Like that can't be farther from the truth. But there is this sense of patriotism and nationalism that is taking hold that is rooted in the idea that we might have to stand on our own. We're not getting the support that we thought we would from the Western community, people that we thought were our closest allies and partners. And that is something that could come to define what Ukraine looks like post-war, and or even in the next couple of years or few years to come, if this war is dragging on and Ukraine is not yet in the European Union, and there's a lot of discussion about what to do with a country that has this simmering conflict ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, Amie, I was going to ask you something else, but in some ways, doesn't that remind you, because I know you're like me, a Balkan watcher, doesn't it remind you of the situation that the Balkan countries have had with the European Union? That the European Unions have kind of dangled this idea of EU entry for a long time in front of these countries. And that has an impact on the society when it goes on for years and decades and it never happens. It starts to change the fabric of the society, because previously so much of the political energy was dedicated to getting into the EU. But when they find the EU door closed, that political energy has to go somewhere, and often it goes in the opposite direction. You've seen this, I mean, we've talked about it multiple times, right? All across the edges of the post-Soviet space. You see that happening. It sounds like Chris thinks that the same thing might happen with Ukraine if there isn't an EU entry forthcoming.
No, absolutely. I think it's a common trajectory that if you are coalescing around a sort of dream or vision of where you're going to go, such a better place, like joining the EU, a supposedly better place option in this case, joining the EU. And if that doesn't happen, and if it continues to not happen for a long time, it makes sense that you would look inward. It makes sense completely from a population's point of view, and we've seen it over and over again.
But part of the news hook for the podcast was that Trump has given Russia 50 days to agree to a peace deal, or to be hit with heavy sanctions. And really, in a normal conversation, that would have been the way into the podcast. But I think it's taken us so long into the podcast to get around to it, because is it going to make any difference? Are we 50 days away from peace?
We're already not 50 days away from peace, because Russia's deputy foreign minister has already poo-pooed this and said any attempts to make demands, especially ultimatums, are unacceptable to us. So, I mean, we're literally not even, a day in?
Yeah.
Well, it's worse than that too, right? I mean, this is essentially Trump giving them a blank check saying, I'm not going to be doing anything to try to stop you in the next 50 days, right? There was the sanctions bill that Congress is going to be debating and perhaps trying to pass that could have ended up on Donald Trump's desk and available for him to use as leverage over Russia. Instead, we get 50 more days of Russia pounding Ukrainian cities, killing people and dragging out its war and escalating its ground offensive before Trump says he's willing to even consider taking any kind of action.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the point you were getting to, Amie. That as Chris says, Trump offers them essentially 50 days to attack with impunity.
Yeah, ridiculous.
And the Russians say, yeah, that's not enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Immediately, without any waiting.
I mean, it does make you question Trump's
leverage that he has with Putin. Is that?
Well, he claims he's got leverage. I mean, about these secondary tariffs. So he says he's going, if Russia breaks this, well, it's already broken it, but that he's going to put secondary tariffs on buyers of Russian oil like India and China. I mean, I personally don't think that really works. Russia will sell its oil to people who want it regardless, as it has proven throughout this war.
I mean, we're 3 years into them, and maybe less than 3 years now, because the mechanism didn't come in, I think, until the end of the first year. But in any case, we're at least a couple of years into this mechanism, which is designed to stop people buying it. They bought more.
Yeah. No, Russia's loving. I mean, Russia's rolling in it.
That alone might not change Russia's calculus, right? But collectively, the United States does have leverage, right? It has the most powerful and largest, army in the world. It's got weapons that it could still provide to Ukraine. It has long-range weapons it could provide to Ukraine if it wanted to. It could marshal more support from allies to provide greater air defense systems to Ukraine. It also has the ability to use frozen Russian assets, which no one has yet done, right? And those things collectively, on top of trying to impact global oil prices, could be used as leverage and maybe change Russia's calculus. But he's not prepared to do those things. And to be fair, the Biden administration, obsessed and worried with escalation management, also wasn't prepared to do that.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about the Biden administration, Chris, because do you think that's perhaps the fundamental problem here? That for 3 years there has been this management of the conflict, at first by the Biden administration, to make sure that Ukraine can't win, but that Russia loses?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was concern about escalation, and I don't think it was always unfounded. I think at certain moments during the war, it wouldn't have made sense to provide certain things. And they also, I mean, to say something controversial, I think there are some things that were provided to appease the Ukrainians that haven't really done much for them on the battlefield. Abrams tanks, for example, which use jet fuel that's really difficult to come by, and are these machines that are extremely difficult to use, are hardly ever seen and utilized on the battlefield anymore, especially when the battlefield is covered in drones that cost a mere few $100s, and they're capable of attacking these multi-million-dollar tanks and destroying them in just a couple of blows, right? So part of this was a calculated risk of escalation, but also, you can't just flood the battlefield with things and not have people to use them. So maybe I'm tacking a little bit here to say that it wasn't all just on the West. There have been a lot of decisions that the Ukrainians have made or not made that also could have impacted the trajectory of the war. Look, we could sit here and play woulda, coulda, shoulda, and sometimes that's kind of fun, after we all file our stories at the end of the evening and we're sitting down for a round. But yeah, I do think that early on, at least, the Biden administration did set the tone, right? That they weren't going to go in big and tough with these massive security packages for Ukraine. I think, first of all, them and many others counted Ukraine out from the very beginning and didn't think that they would last weeks, let alone years. And so they were hesitant at first to send things in at risk of it being lost. And then they weren't sure, of course, how much longer the war would last, right? So I think it's maybe a lack of foresight and strategy, too, that had a major impact on the trajectory of the war and has ended up, where we are now.
I have one more question I wanted to ask, but actually just before that, because we've talked about the shifting attitudes toward the war inside Ukraine. It'd be remiss, Amie, if I didn't ask you about the shifting attitudes to the war inside Russia. Putin and his acolytes in the media have tightly controlled the narrative within the country about this, not a war, of course, a special military operation. Do you think that there are signs that is shifting now 3 years in?
Well, if anything, it's shifting deeper, looking inwards. And I think, obviously, I haven't, well, maybe not obviously, but I haven't been to Russia recently, and almost no one from the West is reporting from there, from within. But it's pretty clear, and we've reported on this at New Lines magazine over and over, which is that Russia is moving closer towards totalitarianism. And if you have total totalitarian control, it doesn't really matter what the people's shifting feelings are, does it? Because everything is going to be controlled. And from what we're seeing, from the horrible things that are happening in Russia, from bringing in Russian soldiers who have proudly killed Ukrainian civilians and then bring them into schools to speak to 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds about their feats. And I mean, if that's the kind of attitude and narrative that Russia is shaping, then we can see where it's going. I mean, it's just getting tighter and more controlled. And the Moscow I knew is gone. It's long gone.
I wanted to end by asking the flip side of the question that we started with, which was that if Ukraine has to get used to this war without end, then, well, what about Russia? I don't think it's a surprise that in Russia has managed to transform its economy into a war economy over the past 3 years. But I wonder what it might do if there were a genuine peace. So the question really is, can Russia live without war?
I mean, Russia is a great fan of frozen conflicts, right? I mean, I reported out of Russia for almost 9 years, and there were so many frozen conflicts, including in its own country, in Chechnya and across the North Caucasus.
What was that joke somebody said once, that frozen conflicts are to Russia what regime changes to the Americans?
Well, right. I mean, that pretty much sums it up. I mean,
because you look all around the borders of Russia. I mean, they love creating frozen conflicts.
They love it. They love it, and they love creating it. They love maintaining it. They love pretending to mediate.
Yeah.
I mean,
Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia, Moldova, Transnistria.
I mean, they just it keeps the illusion going that Russia is good and is surrounded by trouble and people who are against Russia's way of life and poor Russia and all of this. It's good for the Russian government. And I mean, Chris and I actually, we met in eastern Ukraine, in Ukraine after Maidan. And so that's already 11 years of a conflict happening in Ukraine, or rather Russia meddling in Ukraine's affairs militarily. And I mean, I personally see that continuing into the future. But of course, I'm talking about the east of Ukraine, but I'd love to hear, of course, what Chris says about that.
Yeah, I think Russia loves war, being here since even before 2014 when you and I met, Amie. I've, like Ukrainians here, experienced Russia attacking this country now for more than 11 years. It's really hard for Ukrainians. It's really hard for me to imagine a Russia that isn't waging war in Ukraine, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in another place. It just, to me, seems as though, at least, if not historically so, then in this day and age, in among this generation of its leaders, it's very much an essential part of Russia. And I can't imagine what a Russia would be like on the day after, let's say, Vladimir Putin dies and or this war comes to an end. I don't know what they would do in order to satiate their curiosities and adventurous, bloodthirsty nature at this point after seeing and experiencing what I have the past 11 years here in Ukraine.
Christopher Miller, Amie Ferris-Rotman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines Magazine. You can find Christopher Miller's book, The War Came to Us, online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.